Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sanju Maharzan and I'm involved in ASHRI as Emerging Fellows Committee member. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to briefly introduce ASHRI. The Academic Advisory Council for Signage, Research and Education, ASHRI, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing thought leadership in on-premise signage. Our mission is to foster and disseminate interdisciplinary research in signage and wayfinding by driving innovation across academia and related fields. Our vision is to spark collaboration that shapes the future of signage and wayfinding in the built environment. Next. Since 2017, the ASHRI Emerging Fellowships have supported early career scholars in the field of on-premise signage. To date, over 25 fellows have been named, receiving $160,000 in awards. This multidisciplinary group explores a wide range of topics, from information processing and emotional response to signage to its impact on sustainability and consumer well-being. The screen displays the list of 2025, 2026 ASHRI Emerging Fellows, including both returning and new members. Our emerging fellow today is Grace Ongyan, Associate Professor of Interior Design at Thomas Jefferson University. She is currently Dr. Stephen Kopp. Please join me in welcoming our emerging fellow, Grace Ongyan, who will now take the floor.
Thanks, Sanju. And thanks for the board of ASHRI for this grant. I'm happy to be presenting my research today. So my talk is entitled Wayfinding in the Modern City, Environmental Graphics and the Crisis of Architectural Communication. So in the spirit of interdisciplinary research, I am coming as an architectural historian, and my research is a historical study on wayfinding. So, okay, my first slide. Okay. So just to give a little context to this talk, I've been on sabbatical this semester, and which has been great for research. And I have been working on a book proposal, and this is a draft of the first of the introduction, which kind of gives the narrative, sets the scene for the book. So be great to get feedback on it. So, okay. So cities are shaped by a dense mesh of forces, social, economic, political, and aesthetic, and no single designer ever controls their visual or spatial coherence. Environmental graphics and signage emerge from dispersed processes of decision-making, municipal codes, commercial interest, institutional needs, and everyday users. Yet the history of modern architecture has rarely acknowledged how essential these graphic systems became for clarifying and navigating the post-war American city. My research examines this historical moment and the role of graphics. By the 1960s, US cities were saturated with advertising, traffic signage, commercial imagery, and visual noise. At the same time, the limits of modern architecture and large-scale planning schemes were becoming painfully apparent. Urban renewal efforts produced spaces that were often abstract, oversized, and difficult to read. While the automobile shaped circulation patterns in ways that place new demands on legibility and orientation. The modernist belief that architectural form alone could communicate clarity or order no longer aligned with the realities of the information-rich, psychologically taxing urban environment. It was in this context that graphic design emerged as an unlikely hero. Designers and planners began to recognize that the city could not rely solely on architectural form to structure experience. Instead, it required supplementary systems of communication capable of mediating complexity and supporting human cognition. Environmental graphics, including signage, symbols, color systems, surface treatments, and spatially engaged typography offered a means of giving shape to the post-war city that architecture alone could not provide. Far from mere decoration, graphic interventions bridge the gap between the abstract ambitions of modernist space and the lived realities of its users. They clarified circulation, established hierarchies of information, and made overwhelming environments newly legible and navigable. By situating environmental graphics within the historical pressures that define the late modern American city, my research argues for a rethinking of their role in architectural and urban history. Rather than being peripheral to quote unquote real architectural production, environmental graphics constituted a critical layer of urban communication, one that addressed the psychological demands of modern life and compensated for the failures of architectural determinism. Understanding how graphic design function as both a corrective and a complement to modernist planning allows us to reconsider the city not merely as a field of built forms, but as a complex informational landscape, which graphics played a decisive and often under-recognized role. In 1964, architect Peter Blake passionately declared the American urban landscape a disaster. In God's Own Junkyard, his photographic indictment of post-war cities, Blake critiqued what he saw as visual chaos: commercial sprawl, prefabricated buildings, parking lots draped in asphalt, and above all, the relentless cacophony of billboards and advertising signage that transformed once dignified streetscapes into carnival sideshows. His imagery operated as a deliberate critique, juxtaposing the picturesque, unspoiled nature and harmonious architectural planning against the commercial vernacular of garish signage hawking Christmas ornaments for 39 cents. On one level, Blake's attack on commercialism was out of sheer ugliness of billboards lining the highways. On another level, the root of his attack was on capitalism and what he called unregulated private profit from land speculation. He revealed that while cities had planning commissions, the advertising industry used variances rendering those laws and codes ineffectual. His thesis addressed many scales of urban life by connecting the deteriorating city to its negative effects on its inhabitants. What Blake witnessed was more than aesthetic decline, it was a crisis of humanism. Modernist city planning was in part to blame, as its theories, epitomized by the functional city concepts of Siam, had produced environments that were increasingly difficult for ordinary people to navigate and understand. Architect Le Corbusier's Athens Charter, published in 1943 and written in 1933, advanced the idea that the city should be organized for four separate functions. The modern city was conceived as a rational, readable system whose order was spatial, not graphic. The charter's premise was that if urban form was rational enough, signage should be unnecessary. The charter did not anticipate the actual complexity of modern cities. So Blake's condemnation did not go unchallenged. A parallel generation of architectural and urban critics, including Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown and Rainer Banham, also responded to the commercial vernacular in cities. By the 60s, the modernist project, which was based in early 20th century ideals of universality, um, technological optimism, and social progress, faced profound criticism. Its claim that rational planning could solve urban problems became increasingly flawed amid the visual, psychological, and social crises of post-war cities. Where Blake saw junk, these writers perceived complexity, vitality, and legitimate urban function. Venturi Scott Brown's Main Street is Almost All Right, and the later Learning from Las Vegas, positioned signage as central to architectural communication. Rainer Banham celebrated the lack of planning in Los Angeles's commercial strips, admiring the flamboyance of the signage. Unlike orthodox city planners who fulminate against the signs, Banham embraced the novelty of commercial signage, as well as their obsolescence and replacement. Graphic design critic Stephen Heller has noted most commercial graphics were not created by trained graphic designers at all, but by non-designers producing stock cuts and pre-prepared advertisements focused solely on selling. Ultimately, architecture as symbol failed because of the lack of objectivity and interpretation, but these voices opened intellectual space for reconsidering commercial signage. Um, but the semiotic or postmodern architectural discourse that emerged from the critiques remained untenable. Instead, my research focuses on the late modern historical moment of the 60s and 70s in which designers worked in the graphic medium to address not only the urban communication problems that both Blake and his critics identified, but the psychological issues caused by post-war cities as well. So the crisis was fundamentally perceptual. As cities grew more complex and fragmented, traditional methods of urban planning broke down. In the 60s and 70s, designers and theorists included Aldo van Eyck and Team 10, Kevin Lynch, Sybil Moholy-Nagy, Jane Jacobs, Aldo Rossi, Colin Rowe, and Fred Coder confronted the failures of modernist urban renewal. They sought pathways to city plans defined by human experience and scale. Their ideas included Van Eyck and Team 10's call for human associations and placemaking, and Rowe and Coder's irregular collage-like city, which recalled Camilo Sitte's urban theories nearly a century before. Sitte critiqued modern zoning and the rigid planning of Haussmann's Paris, instead proposing cities designed as works of art, rooted in aesthetic and human experience. Amid this breakdown, the new field of environmental psychology emerged to reframe the problem. As an alliance of, let me just forward. Oh, right. Also, at this time, signage was used as tools for disruption with visual impact in public protests. Activists enunciated graphically and with choreographed paths that embody freedom of speech through protest. So, amid this breakdown, the new field of environmental psychology emerged to reframe the problem. As an unlikely alliance of disciplines, the rise of environmental psychology provided architects and designers with a new approach for developing humanism in cities and addressing the failures of modernist environments. It was a specific response to the urban crisis that made the city a psychological subject with disorders of alienation, sensory overload, and a loss of identity. Researchers such as Kevin Lynch, Edward T. Hall, Robert Summer, William White, and Amos Rappaport argued that successful environments were not merely functional or formal, but cognitively and emotionally legible. Their work emphasized how people read and responded to their surroundings through theories of wayfinding, legibility, proxemics, personal space, and cultural meaning. These pioneering figures responded with intense research towards discovering what made environments legible, meaningful, and responsive to human perceptual and cognitive needs. From within the design discipline, urbanist Kevin Lynch built his research upon thinkers from social science and the humanities, including John Dewey and Suzanne Langer. His seminal The Image of the City, published in 1960, explained that successful urban environments depend not on formal architectural qualities alone, but on their what he called imageability, which he defined as their capacity to create clear, memorable mental maps in the minds of their users. Referencing research on animals' internal navigation systems, Lynch emphasized a connection between the external physical shape of the built environment and humans' ability to mentally grasp and internally understand places. We must consider, wrote Lynch, not just the city as a thing in itself, but the city being perceived by its inhabitants. While wayfinding can be traced back to prehistoric cognitive mapping, Kevin Lynch was an early theorist in the formal practice of wayfinding. He defined it as the consistent use of and organization of definite sensory cues from the external environment. Wayfinding, he explained, is fundamental to the efficiency and the survival of free-moving life. In the process of wayfinding, the strategic link is the environmental image, defined as the product of immediate sensation and memory of past experience, collective and individual. He emphasized the importance of emotional security with a good environmental image. Environments must be designed and built with human perception and orientation in mind. He believed that signage should not be suppressed by policies because they add to the visual character of the scene, and more importantly, they are a source of information for city dwellers. The purpose of any sign policy, he wrote, should be to increase and clarify the information communicated. Like Peter Blake, graphic designers saw that post-war cities had become fundamentally unreadable. Graphic designer Ivan Chermayev described how environments, open quote, Countless signs in all shapes and sizes vie for attention, like shrill egos and important messages can become submerged in the trivia. In some hyperactive downtown areas like Times Square, circus-like signage is not only acceptable, but appropriate, creating what has been called a living museum of our brand of material culture. But such pockets of disorder have to have tight edges. Chermayeff did not reject the commercial vernacular, but sought to limit it and imagine opportunities for new design. He illustrated his point of view with the interdisciplinary design of the 1973 TKTS kiosk by Mayers and Schiff as an example of a design dynamic and bold enough to capture the attention among the quote unquote promotional cacophony of the commercial signage. If urban theory and psychology established wayfinding as a framework, it was graphic designers who turned it into a tangible interdisciplinary practice. Swiss graphic designer Walter Herdeg, founder of the influential graphics magazine, observed, "Today's city dweller is constantly exposed to a flood of impressions that make it more and more difficult for him to find his way around without clear visual aids to orientation. It is the task of the graphic designer, in cooperation with architects and traffic planners, to provide easily comprehensible orientation and signage systems that put a little order into our optical chaos." Herdeg stressed interdisciplinary collaboration as new way forward in making cities livable and designed for human perception and experience. Graphic designer Ellen Lupton provided a theoretical framework for the expanded role of graphics in cities. In her analysis, graphic design was not merely an aesthetic overlay on cities, but constitutive of how cities function, especially in capitalist, consumer-oriented societies. Signs, symbols, maps, and other graphic systems, she argued, mediate people's experience of urban environments, making space legible and navigable. Like architecture, it structures our perception of space. She contrasts the ambitions of architecture with the everyday service-oriented role of graphic design, arguing that environmental graphics and signage shape how people understand and move through cities. This perspective opened the door to understanding signage not as junk, but as a fluid, contested language of power, identity, and navigation. Working with J. Abbott Miller, Lupton examined how advertising and consumer signage had fundamentally redefined urban space in 20th century America. Rather than treating this transformation as purely negative, they explored it as a shift in perspective. Architecture was no longer their primary carrier of urban meaning, graphics were. This insight suggested that the solution to urban visual chaos lay in the conscious control of graphic communication as a civic medium. This transformation required abandoning the modernist ideal that architectural form alone could communicate meaning, embracing instead a more complex understanding of how people navigate, understand, and inhabit urban space. Previously, the divide of architecture and graphic design as distinct disciplines did not exist. In the early 1920s and 30s, modernist theory conceived of architecture, typography, and graphic design equally and as related disciplines of a unified approach. Before graphic design became a discipline, it and architecture were done by the same person. As an example, Herbert Bayer practiced not only graphic design, but architecture, typography, photography, and exhibit design, advocating for the integration of all arts throughout his career. There were many others in the late 19th century and early 20th century, including Peter Behrens, L. Lissitzky, Theo van Doesburg, and Le Corbusier. Let's see. For Le Corbusier, the pavilion form allowed him to explore graphic art, architectural form, space, and publicity, and also the connection of two-dimensional surface and three-dimensional space. His 1929 Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau featured a graphic wall covered with a large-scale EN on its unused side. On one hand, the graphic wall promoted his journal, L'Esprit Nouveau, whose mission was to explore and define modernity. Analyzing the graphic wall, we see that while the letters were painted flat on the surface, they were rendered three-dimensionally, as if receding into the building, in what architectural historian Daniel Nagel calls habitable representation. For Le Corbusier, who used the term architectonic color, Surface color was tied to the material form of a building and its architectural expression. Color use to him elicited a constant human reaction as he aimed to standardize color use in architecture. Um, in 1928, Le Corbusier designed a temporary pavilion to publicize the chocolate company Nestle. The pavilion, erected at local fairs in Paris, Marseille, and Bordeaux, was a demountable structure. Nestle, in prominent all capital letters, was painted on the front facade, with Nestle branded canisters and other company products intentionally displayed. The complementary color palette of the pavilion featured baby blue and red paint, giving a dynamic and striking high contrast effect. Research has shown that red can quicken heart rates and add energy, while blue can affect the release of chemicals, which steadies the heart and respiration rate, which can be calming. Used together, the colors create a certain psychological and physiological harmony. Nagel describes the overall effect of the pavilion as fusing words and machine form into a unity. This shows the unity of architecture and graphics as part of the modernist project, combined with the use of color as psychologically affecting the occupants. Starting in the mid 1950s, collaborations of architects and graphic designers created environmental graphics. The development of environmental graphics aspired towards the integration of the two disciplines, with achievements as well as tensions between the two. In the early 20th century, a single designer would take on both disciplines. By the mid-century, with building sizes and programs becoming more complex, as well as graphic design becoming its own discipline, the two split and interdisciplinary processes resulted. Several architectural journals reported on this trend, dedicating articles and whole issues to what was termed either architectural graphics, environmental graphics, or in some cases, super graphics. Projects included in the architectural record feature discuss the graphic designers and architects working together at the time. Elaine Lustig with Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, and Kahn and Jacobs on the graphics for the Seagrams building in New York. Alvin Lustig with architect Victor Gruen on the Northland Shopping Center, and graphic designer Don Page, who headed up the in-house graphics department at IM Pei and Associates. Victor Gruen described the challenges of graphic design and architecture, acknowledging the difficulty of integration when signage demands do not align with the building design or the sign design occurs after the building design is completed. He advocated for graphic design to be incorporated into the building design process and even called for graphic design instruction in architecture school curricula. In the late 1960s, articles in numerous issues of the journal Progressive Architecture were written on the environmental graphics phenomenon known as supergraphics by editor C. Ray Smith. Smith chronicles supergraphics as architectural experiments that broke from modernist austerity through a humanist turn towards communication and public engagement. Barbara Stouffacher Solomon designed one of the most iconic supergraphics projects at Sea Ranch in 1966, approaching it from the functional point of view of wayfinding. Open quote, supergraphics are different from the old two-dimensional graphics, she said, and they're more helpful to architects. I don't do them to create cute chaos. They are a reinforcement of architecture. You reinforce traffic and patterns. It's an aid to circulation. End quote. By defining supergraphics design as wayfinding, Stouffacher Solomon firmly casts her designs as functionalist, not decorative. She denied the postmodern nature of supergraphics, which aligned with her Swiss modernist graphic design education. By the late 1970s, approaching environmental graphics as a reinforcement of architecture evolved and developed. Environmental graphic designers Folis and Hammer defined architectural graphics as abstract wall designs used to enliven large public spaces, as well as building interiors. They specifically define architectural graphics' primary function as an enhancement of architecture rather than the communication of information. Architectural graphics, they explained, are functional decorative designs which enhance architecture in various ways, such as providing an effective focal point, adding color detail or sense of scale, or reinforcing the architectural design or supporting the thematic idea. In 1976, the October issue of the AIA Journal was dedicated to environmental graphics. By this time, the practice transcended the function of communication and wayfinding to giving a sense of place and identity. Environmental graphics were integrated with an extension of the environment rather than something separate. Associate editor Andrea O. Dean wrote about environmental graphics as a cure for a modernism that had become monotonous. In an attempt to enliven their buildings, wrote Dean, and especially to humanize them, all at relatively low cost, the finished work of environmental graphics were considered an actual part of an extension of the environment rather than something separate. Big bare walls, she wrote, began to beckon seductively. Some architects and critics belittled environmental graphics as a kind of cover up or cosmetic surgery for poorly designed buildings or a tired fad. However, others, including Doris Friedman, president of City Walls Incorporated of New York, considered the embellishment of walls with paintings as a form of instant urban renewal, upgrading architecture and uplifting human spirits. She called them outside paintings that had gone from simply communicating to us to communing with us. From the 1950s to the 1970s, environmental graphics evolved from signs on buildings to giving identity to interior architectural and urban spaces. They made all who live in them understandable. So, my plan going forward, that's the last slide. Okay, is to write about 4 environmental graphic case studies from the 1950s to the 70s. They're arranged by scale from the smallest to the largest, and they all exemplify the kind of environmental graphics that go beyond wayfinding and simple signage to give place and identity and spatially engage the graphic surface. The topics um, they range in human scale from small to intimate to large and public. On the left is super graphics experiments, and then down from that is Herbert Bayer's architectural murals at the Aspen Institute. And then to the right of the super graphics is the City Walls Incorporated mural project. And then on the right is Cambridge 7's Boston subway system, signage system. So they'll show that the graphic interventions helped redefine not only how cities looked, but how they were understood, navigated, and lived. So today, as cities once again confront crises of identity, equity, and overload, the history of these graphic interventions remains urgently relevant. Rather than rejecting signage as junk, we look again at how graphics brought clarity to chaos, legibility to complexity, and humanity to the modern city.
We will now open the floor to any questions or comments from anybody.
I could start with questions if that's okay, Grace.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Well, first and foremost, uh, what a lovely and from a graphic designer who's worked within an architecture firm, I would say very
Oh, great.
timely presentation. I, for
Thank
one,
you.
would be deeply fascinated with a book around this topic, and it's one that I am sure I'm not alone in like at several points in my career imagining someone writing a book like this. So I think you're right there. And yeah, many of the precedents and even some of the case studies that you're looking at are quite familiar. And along those lines, I was interested. You mentioned at the tail end of the presentation, there's 5 that you're going to kind of do a more deeper dive into, 4 or 5. I was
Yeah.
wondering how you selected those, or like what the thoughts or process was around why those particular examples? Is it, that you just have more documentation and material, that there's something about them that will fit into the structure of the book once you sort of get into the kind of narrative of it? So that's I guess the question. But I am really, if you can't tell, quite excited about this topic. And just
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I really
we
appreciate that.
I think you all know we met in at the in Arkansas at the celebration, and you mentioned briefly what you were doing, but I didn't know really it was now I get a better picture, and this is quite exciting.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's encouraging. So for the case studies, so some of the research was funded by ASRI. Like, I think these all popped up in my literature reviews somehow, and they have archival sources.
Hmm.
Like the City Walls um, Mural Project, they have their archives at NYU and they're, available. The Herbert Bayer information, he worked for Container Corporation of America, and they have very accessible archives. Cambridge 7, that popped up. Um, it's a firm that still exists, but they designed the Boston subway system. They had some archives at School of Visual Arts in New York. So they all have archival sources. That's sort of the key, and I'm trying to string them together as like the scalar change from small and interior to building to city to like like a subway, like a system, like a larger. Um, so that's the attempt.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's a good answer. Yeah, if I may, the secondary piece of this, I don't know how much you'll delve into in the book that I would be fascinated to learn more about is, as you acknowledged even in your short talk today, this disciplinary split. And it's one that still I don't, on a personal note, don't quite understand, so so for a designer of my generation, I remember my professors even in the 90s in a pretty traditional design department saying like, well, it didn't used to be like this. And what they were really saying, and as you acknowledged in your talk, was that the design disciplines were much more of a singular enterprise, and then it's like split more and more and more to the point where anecdotally I hear that in a lot of design departments now, like the colleagues who sit, just down the hall, like, so if you're teaching graphic design and then your colleagues are teaching fashion design, there's just not as much interaction anymore as there used to be when these disciplines were much more fluid. I do
Yeah.
wonder, this is the speculative piece that has nothing to do with history, if at some point we'll see some sort of reemergence of like design disciplines recoalescing around the broader umbrella of design rather than, like I think we've reached a fairly saturated silo point in our history, which could continue to become more siloed or not. I don't know, but that's just thinking out loud. Of course, I would hope that we become much more congealed and collaborative and interdisciplinary. And I see some places doing it, but not too many.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I taught an interdisciplinary studio with graphic design a couple years ago, and it was a little shocking how split the disciplines are and how the disciplines see the other disciplines as, I don't know, there's some antagonism there between the two,
Yes,
surprisingly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But looking historically, it was really interesting. Like, I wasn't able to talk about all of it, but there were those tensions of like, oh, the architects don't want, the graphics mucking up their building facade. And graphic designers like, oh, those architects, they're always using their sans serif typefaces. That's not, there are so many more typefaces, these kind of like jabs at each other. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I've seen plenty of that.
Yeah.
Oh,
thank
Well,
that's
I
great.
I really appreciate Dan's questions because I don't know enough about this area specifically to ask good questions like that. Um, so the examples that you showed were really interesting to me, and that must have been a ton of work just to try to find uh, I don't want to call them examples, but really um, uh, the typical or at least very exemplary kinds of uses of signage. I don't even know how to express my uh, my interest in this because I don't have the vocabulary. What I want to ask is when urban planners, urban designers, urban architects, when you begin to say, well, this is helpful to people, it is, how do you how do you um, how do you measure that? How do you assess the appropriateness or final effects and their effectiveness as wayfinding or as um, communication?
That's a really good question. Like is this sign doing its job?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe some of the more social science researchers can
Well, see,
can help with
that's
that.
why I'm
Yeah.
asking
Yeah.
because as a social scientist myself, I think,
Yeah.
well, we always try to pursue these things for to be measured, right? And so you can assess, attitudes or intentions or, any of the other stuff that like regular consumer behavior researchers um, might measure to find the effectiveness of a sign or a piece of information.
And also sort of like does it like if a sign is designed by a graphic designer versus one that's not,
Yeah,
that one more effective
right.
or how?
Could I
Yeah.
And
go?
and affecting not just the cognitive parts of a person's behavior, but uh, emotions and uh, other kinds of like subjective kinds of properties.
You just said what I was just about to
Yeah,
add.
well, this whole conversation really resonates with me. So,
Yeah, like there's the to your last point, the soup thickens when you take into account the humanistic, cultural, and emotional aspects of signage.
mm,
And we could all give our own examples, but in Boston, just as one example, we have the Citgo sign, which was traditional, illuminated signage. But if anybody tried to remove the Citgo sign in Boston, there would
mm,
be protests.
mhm.
That's the
Yeah.
affinity for like signage. So to your point, but how do you quantify that or qualify it? It's
Right.
messy.
Do you have any references for that, Steve, on who would do research, does that kind of research in the social science realm?
Well, I think two of them are probably on this Zoom call. I, Ma- I mean, I know that Matt has worked with Jennifer Hong
Okay.
in
Yeah.
some of her previous stuff, and then trying to think through other fellers. I guess Daniel Villanova and Leah Smith are not on this call, but they were fellows that had worked on some
Okay.
behavioral kinds of stuff the last couple of years.
Okay, great.
And I'll think about it some more. I love this topic since you presented it to us the very first time, since you applied for this fellowship. So this is really cool. It's
Thank
great.
you. Thank you. Oh, Lucia, did you have it?
Yeah, I mean, first I
Yeah.
want to just echo that super exciting and the depth of the parallel histories you're building are super interesting. I was wondering, I missed the beginning of your presentation because I was in another waiting room, but so I came in a bit
Mm.
late. Um, but I was wondering, so your next step will be to, dig into those case studies that are sort of organized or sequenced by scale, and I imagine by typology as well, like from an architectural point of view, right? So you talked about interior spaces and then all the way to systems such as infrastructure of subways and so on, no? So then kind of like I just wonder in this process of you creating those parallel histories and finding the moments of convergence and the moments of split, right? What 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 emerges? I mean, have you figured out a couple of hypotheses that were through this journey have been emerging? Like, what do we learn, right? Like, what are the exciting, couple of exciting stories that could be told through this parallel mapping of intersections and splits of, graphic
Mhm.
designers working with architects and so on, and coming up with all of those new terms like environmental graphics and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Great question. I mean, one of the, I guess, underlying things I'm exploring is this relationship between flatness, like 2D and 3D, and also the moment of, because I think the flatness is really associated with postmodern architecture, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
Venturis and the,
Mm-hmm.
those people. Um, and the design that they did, which was very flat. Like I'm thinking, what's that guy's name with the flat buildings? Um, I'm like blanking, but that actually it really started in modernism. Like if we see like Le Corbusier in the 20s and 30s painting flat, basically doing signage, which you don't think of being that early, but he was definitely exploring flatness and signage as a modernist. So I hope that, yeah, we start to carve open our understanding of modernism in alternate ways that engages with, signage, which was there, since the 19th century, but architecture never wanted to sort of,
Knowledge. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah.
And you think this is going to be the lens you will be looking into the analysis of the new presidents?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that will be that lens, right? It's kind of like understanding of modernism in different types and hmm.
Yeah.
Because
I think
they're
one of
going to be
the
from the 50s to the 70s, right? That's what you mentioned. The five.
case studies. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, Pomo and more recent contemporary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's a lot. It's very layered. So I'm just trying to see, what the lens might be because you can tell so many stories out of it. Like you're doing all of this incredible work and so many stories could be told.
Yeah, yeah, and also as you mentioned, like the graphic designer and the architect, like that collaboration. And is there something that will come out of the archival research that I can find about stories between, like, let's say Alvin Lustig and Victor Gurin and
Mm.
that collaboration?
Hmm.
And there are many of them, and I might be able to sort of find the historical record of how those played out, which could be really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking forward.
Thank you.